Hello everyone, I'm Donald Wallenfang and a pleasure to be with you on this video about phenomenology and what's called the natural attitude in phenomenology. So I want to shed a little more light on the subject here before we get going. There we go. So if you've heard of phenomenology or studied phenomenology, you've also heard of what's called the natural attitude. And the natural attitude is a problem for phenomenology. It's what gets in the way. It is a great obstacle that has to be bracketed and set aside. So I want to spend the majority of this video, also podcast stream, talking about the natural attitude and why it's a problem for phenomenology, how it is bracketed and set aside. So I welcome you if you're able to attend via the live stream here. And if not, I also welcome you if you're able to watch the video after the fact. So the first thing I want to do, though, is reorient us as to what is phenomenology, going back to some of Husserl's original definitions. So Edmund Husserl, the father of phenomenology, early 20th century, he's developing this method. In 1900, 1901, publishes the first two breakthrough books, 2 volumes called The Logical Investigations. And then also in 1913, he would publish his book, The Ideas Pertaining to a Pure Phenomenology and to a Phenomenological Philosophy. So it's called Ideas for short, and it's a lot more developed than what is in the Logical Investigations. And then he has 2 subsequent volumes, also called Ideas. So Husserl has Ideas 1, Ideas 2, Ideas 3, in a kind of trilogy of laying out this method of phenomenology, and many other books too. One of my personal favorites is this little book simply called The Idea of Phenomenology, featuring 5 lectures when he was teaching at Göttingen. So these books are very helpful to get in to Husserl's phenomenology. And also I'd recommend Dan Zahavi has a book, Husserl's Phenomenology, published in 2003. And in addition to that, Paul Ricoeur has a book about Husserl and his phenomenology. Emmanuel Levinas wrote about it also. Jean-Luc Marion's book, Reduction and Givenness, gets us into the thick of it also. So many other books, of course, but these are a few I would mention that come to mind right away. But Husserl, in this little book, The Idea of Phenomenology, these 1907 Göttingen lectures. So this is very early, and he publishes this before his major volume called Ideas Pertaining to a Pure Phenomenology and to a Phenomenological Philosophy. So I'm going to take a few quotes from this, The Idea of Phenomenology. And the first thing Husserl says about phenomenology, he calls it a method. When we think of a method, I'm just going to share my screen and get into the etymology of the term method. When we think of method, come right back to it. When we think of method, it comes from the Greek meta hodos. And so what that means is meta, in a sense, beyond or through, and then hodos, away. So away through the thicket, away beyond, a method to get us from where we are to where we want to go. A method. So phenomenology is a method of philosophy. Of course, it's not the only one, but it is one of them, and the premier method to the present. Metahodos, method, away through, away beyond, a way to get us through the gauntlet of a situation, a way to break through an aporia, of thought. So the aporia happening in Husserl's time was what was called psychologism. And this is very relevant for us today in the 21st century. It hasn't gone away at all. It's actually increased in force, in magnitude, in following. And psychologism also could be called subjectivism and relativism, a relativizing of thought, of so-called truth, a relativizing of knowledge, as if knowledge is reducible to each individual human subject and what he or she thinks about a thing. As if epistemology has no universal foundations. It's simply ephemeral in the particular, in a particular individual subjectivity. Psychologism, as if meaning and truth are products of an individual human subject. And Husserl says, no, this is not the objective truth of the matter. There actually are universal essences that come first, and we as human subjects receive them and then deal with them and interpret them. So phenomenology, he says in this book, The Idea of Phenomenology is the method of the critique of cognition. So he's similar to Immanuel Kant in this way. Immanuel Kant, who has his three critiques of pure reason, of practical reason, and of judgment. So to critique cognition, we have to do at this point in the history of Western philosophy, there's no question about it. We have to continue to critique cognition so that cognition, thinking, the ego life, would be humbled in relation to reality and not take the place of it in itself. So the ego is a double-edged sword, and we have this saying, in English, he or she has a big ego, or someone can be egocentric, concerned about themselves only. So the ego is good. It is a big part of philosophy. Yes, there's no philosophy without the ego. Descartes had the point, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. The ego in relation to the ergo. But what is being thought? What is the content of thought? What awakens thought? What breathes life into thought? What animates thought? Not thought itself, but what fills it. So phenomenology is getting at the question, what fills thought? What gives life to cognition? Husserl develops a method of the critique of cognition. The critique of cognition's claim to be all and end all, as if the ego were the absolute for philosophy. No. The ego is in relation to an other thing, person, experience, perception. As we live within lived experience, there is the ego, what Edith Stein calls the 0 point of orientation of an experience, yes, for an individual self. But then the question is, what is experienced? What gives itself to the ego? Giving it to itself. Paul Ricoeur writes a book, Oneself as Another. So Phenomenology is a method in philosophy that has to do with a critique of cognition. This is nothing new with Husserl. It's been happening especially with Kant and the three critiques of pure reason, practical reason, and judgment. A critique of reason is very important because we can do that at this point in the history of Western philosophy. It wasn't always the case. The ego life was taken for granted for centuries. But now that we get into all these epistemological questions and the questions of philosophy of mind and everything, we have to leverage an ongoing critique of cognition so that it does not claim to perceive or know what it actually has no idea about. We have to allow the critique of cognition to go on, and phenomenology is a way forward with this. The method of the critique of cognition is the phenomenological method, Husserl says. Phenomenology, understood as the general doctrine of essences. This is fantastic. This is what's lacking in Kant. This is what's lacking in idealism. A doctrine of essences. What are essences? What are essences? Things in themselves. The things in themselves. Sachen selbst. Things in themselves. Essences. But not just anything in itself, any particular thing in itself as I experience it, but we can also call them universals. Universal things in themselves. Phenomenology begins as and remains a doctrine of essences. Teaching about essences because pursuing essences. Investigation of essences. What lights up cognition? What lights up the ego life? What gives? See, I'm careful not to say, what is the ego? What is the ego life? Is the language of metaphysics, and it has its place. But phenomenology brackets the language of is, and in most cases, brackets the language of being, except in like Heidegger or Dietrich von Hildebrand or Stein. They're going to blend a bit the language of being and phenomenology. But as we see phenomenology working through Levinas and Ricoeur, Ricoeur will bring in the language of being. But Levinas Marion, the more radical phenomenological reduction, is bracketing for sure even the ontological reduction of Heidegger and company. So phenomenology with Husserl, a doctrine of essences, within which the science of the essence of cognition finds its place. So cognition too has its essences, the essences of consciousness. How do we talk about consciousness in a universal manner? Not just my consciousness, your consciousness, as if these are on different planets, different wavelengths, given some even different empirical status or something. But if we get at the spiritual roots of experience, we detect universal essences of things. Husserl goes on to say then that phenomenology involves a cognition which can bring to absolute self-givenness not only particulars, but also universals, universal objects, universal states of affairs. So this is what phenomenology is, especially after with its doctrine of essences. Again, universals, universal objects. So Husserl would begin there with the language of object, because by object is meant the thing in itself. By object is meant the thing in itself. And so universal objects, universal essences, universal states of affairs. So something like the experience of joy. I could have an experience I could describe as joy. You could have an experience you describe as joy. And what Husserl is saying is that there's some kind of universal happening within each of our respective experiences that we identify as joy, that comes first with its givenness, before words, before we call it joy. But there's a givenness within the lived experience that is not just similar, but the same. And this is why we would call it a universal essence. And that universal essence, which we belatedly call joy, is the right for its own phenomenal manifestation. So the special character of phenomenology, Husserl says, consists in the fact that it is the analysis of essence and the investigation into essence in the area of pure seeing. So it begins here. Like much Greek philosophy, there's a privilege of the sense of sight in terms of what's being experienced or what's being thought. And we have this saying in English, I see what you mean, which is to say, I get it. I know what you're knowing. So Husserl uses at least the metaphor of seeing, a pure seeing. It's a very visual philosophy. For Husserl, it's very visual. For Heidegger, it's rather visual, all about manifestation. For Marion, it's very visual. For Levinas, not so. It's something different, and I hope to have more presentations on Levinas in the future. For Levinas, it's more a matter of hearing, rooted in the Shema, the Hebrew Shema, hear, obey, listen to. In any case, with Husserl, though, he begins with, the Platonic allegory of the cave and seeing the forms in the true light of day. So seeing, a pure seeing, that is thought, and absolute self-givenness. So I know this takes time to understand with Husserl, but it's essential, pun intended. It's important that we take time, because I can't wait to get into presentations about Marion, about Ricoeur, about Levinas, more about Stein and all these different thinkers. But first, we have to understand the building blocks of phenomenology. So I'm taking time to make these videos that get at the building blocks. And it's a little tedious, but it's like, in order to enjoy the flight, you better have some good mechanics. You better take the time to run all the tests and the checks and see that all the parts are in place before we're going to take off from the runway. And then after we land, we need to do all this again and come back to the basics in order to continue to fly and enjoy the flight. So phenomenology is after these pure essences, universal essences of the things themselves, the universal essences of the things themselves that come to us, human subjects, through the experience of the their own unique self-givenness. They give themselves. This is the language of Husserl. This is breakthrough in the history of Western philosophy. To talk about things, object and more than object, and how they give themselves. To talk about the thing we call consciousness or cognition in terms of how it gives itself to. But again, what's the order of things? How does consciousness give itself to itself? Or is consciousness given to itself vis-a-vis the other and the alterity of the phenomenon other than itself? Which is where phenomenology will go, especially with Marion and Levinas. So Husserl sets the stage, though, in calibrating the phenomenological optics, you could say, to be on the lookout for these universal essences, to investigate them, these things in themselves that give themselves by themselves. That is necessarily the character of phenomenology. He says it sets out to be a science and a method which will explain possibilities. And I don't know that explain is the best English word for the translation, because rather than explain, it's to describe possibilities. Possibilities of cognition, possibilities of valuation in terms of meaning. What are the ranks of meaning? What are the magnitudes of meaning? And is there a kind of hierarchy of meanings that we experience even before judgment? Meanings that are persuasive in themselves, even before I say it is so, and through a metaphysical judgment. So the possibilities. Phenomenology is a science of possibility, as every science really is. The possibilities of the data that we receive, we gather up through the course of an experiment and experience. So phenomenology, therefore, is this bedrock of all science. Phenomenology is a science. And even this word science, from the Latin verb scire, to know a thing, to know a matter, to know the relationship between things. Phenomenology begins in always a science of possibility. What could give itself? I don't already know all this. This is why phenomenology is always a new birth, always new life. Every moment is understood in phenomenology as a giving birth, as an eruption of givenness, an advent of givenness, a coming of the thing in itself, the phenomenon, the epiphany of the phenomenon. And even this word epiphany comes from the Greek word phino, which means what gives itself, what shows itself, what manifests itself. Epiphany. Phenomenology involves an epiphany of things themselves, their self-givenness, their self-manifestation, their self-showing. This is phenomenology, a world of givenness, always this world of givenness. And with Husserl, I want to take it one step farther and attempt to discuss what he calls the principle of all principles from his book, Ideas pertaining to a pure phenomenology and to a phenomenological philosophy of 1913. So all this being said, you can go back in the video to look through this. But Husserl talks about a principle of principles. And I'm just going to quote it here and then try to unpack it a bit. But it has some complexity for sure. So Husserl says, every originarily giving intuition is a source of right for cognition. And I'm going to come back and talk about what each of these words mean. That everything that offers itself originarily to us in intuition. What he means by this, in fleshly actuality, so to speak. That's his words. German translated to English. Must simply be received for what it gives itself, but without passing beyond the limits in which it gives itself. Okay. So for Husserl, this is Husserl's principle of principles. So let's think about this together. This is the heavy lifting of philosophy. We have to get in our reps, so to speak, the repetition of thought, and to try to think along with the master, to think along with Husserl. What is he getting at? What is the basis of phenomenology? Is it rational? Does it make sense? What does it benefit human thought? How does it contribute to the annals of wisdom? Okay, so let's take this phrase by phrase. Every. We stop right there. Every. This is to say without exception. So to use the language of everything, every case, every phenomenon, it's a very universal claim. It's not just talking about a particular in a particular case, in a particular instance. It's saying everything is, don't say is, everything happens like this. Every originarily, we'll stop there again. Original, origin, beginning. Phenomenology is after what comes first. What thing happens first? What gives itself first in the order of lived experience? And right away, as important as the ego is, as the ego life is, it is not primary for phenomenology. It falls in line with the rest. From the beginning, the ego is humbled. It's humiliated by the otherness of the phenomenon itself. Because this is a critique of cognition, a critique of the ego life, a critique of the cogito, of the I think. We're getting at in phenomenology everything in its most originary apparition. The thing in itself, the phenomenon, at its inception, at its beginning, to use the Hebrew term, at its bereshit, its genesis, the genesis of givenness. We want, in phenomenology, we want to get to the nucleus of givenness, the heart of the matter. We want to get to the things in themselves as they give themselves by themselves. So you see, as I think out loud through this with Husserl, it's a slow process, but we can be confident that slow and steady wins the race for philosophy. Philosophy is a vocation. It's a call that invites us to think long and wide, deep and high. Philosophy is not something I invent, something I create, something I make, but something more so I discover. And the more the ego can remain humble and continue to undergo a purifying process of humiliation vis-a-vis the otherness of the phenomenon, the better it will serve truth. So Husserl, we're doing a kind of Lectio Divina on this text of the Master. And the beauty of these videos like this on YouTube is that we can spread out a lot more than otherwise, like in a classroom or something where you have a certain amount of time and you have a certain amount of sessions. But for me at this point, I'm very early, God willing, in these YouTube sessions. And so I want to spread out with things together for the sake of precision, accuracy, and ultimately truth. Because phenomenology reopens the door to the veracity of truth, the truthfulness of truth. Because with psychologism, it's a relativization of truth. And truth becomes a shifting target for thought, if a target at all. But phenomenology takes aim, again, through a contemplative gaze at the question, what gives? So Husserl, every originarily, and I keep coming, phenomenology is after what's the most original in experience. What starts the process of lived experience? It wants to recount it. It wants to receive every given essence throughout the course of an experience. And as human subjects, we have the same, we receive the same universal essences that fill experience. Every originarily, and here's the most beautiful word. That's a judgment. I shouldn't do that. But the crescendo, every originarily giving intuition. The accent is on the giving. For phenomenology, every originarily giving intuition. Why does he say intuition? Because he's concentrating the analysis within consciousness. And he's saying that the phenomenon itself, the thing in itself, has given it all the way into the self. in what he calls in his book, The Idea of Phenomenology, an immanent datum of the essence of the phenomenon, an immanent rather than a transcendent one. This is not transcendental idealism, but what Husserl is detecting, the goal that he's finding, is immanent essences for consciousness. How privileged I am to be the recipient, the beneficiary of all of this living, giving intuition. It's a constant givenness. And again, this term, that is the key term in it all for phenomenology. Givenness in German, Gegebenheit. Gegebenheit. Gegeben. Given. Givenness. Every originarily giving intuition, the thing itself, the phenomenon, the essence of the phenomenon, the givenness of the phenomenon. These things are synonymous in the language of Husserl. The given itself is a source. The source from which the water flows, the watershed of the experience, the tap, the source is the originarily giving intuition, the phenomenon, the thing itself that gives itself by itself, is itself the very source of right for cognition. The phenomenon, the things in themselves, give cognition its rights and responsibilities. To think about this in terms of a kind of social doctrine, that the things in themselves give thought itself its right to think, because without all those things that fill cognition, it has no work to do. It has nothing to receive. It's a tabula rasa that remains a tabula rasa. But we think of the very young child here, the very young child who awakens to the light of the morning, the very young child who has not yet experienced a great deal through the course of time, and the very young child, how everything is a precious gift. Everything is very curious and wonder-filled for the child. The giving intuitions themselves are the source for the right for cognition. Cognition has no fundamental rights by itself. It's actually in hibernation without all the giving intuitions. So Husserl continues to use this universal language of everything, that everything that offers itself, again, a crescendo into this term, giving, offering itself originarily to us in intuition. He repeats originarily, but the phenomenon is offering itself to us through what's called intuition. So intuition is a universal essence of consciousness. You have intuition. I have intuition. Every human subject has intuition in as much as we receive phenomena. They are intuited into the ego life, consciousness. This, to use a metaphysical term, the soul. Phenomenology won't use this term so much, but essentially that's what we're getting at, the spiritual ego life of the person that cannot be reduced to neurological matter, to neurobiology, neurochemistry, neurons, brain anatomy. We can't reduce the living experience to these parts of the body which serve as media between the spiritual self and, in fact, the spiritual phenomenon that gives itself by itself. This is why there's a kind of personification of the phenomenon, of the thing itself, even if the thing isn't technically, metaphysically a person per se. But we understand this spiritual phenomenality of giving and receiving within living experience. Okay, and we have another crescendo here, that everything that offers itself originally to us in intuition, in fleshly actuality, so to speak. He's trying to find the right words to describe this wonderful event of receptivity of the phenomenon. Fleshly actuality. It's kind of a metaphysical dependence there on acts, on the concept of Aristotle's energeia in relation to dunamis, in relation to potency. So phenomenology is the science of possibility, Möglichkeit in German, but also there's a kind of Aktualität, a kind of actuality, not in a metaphysical sense exactly here, because we're not talking about cause and effect, we're not talking about change and becoming of being, but what we're talking about is the flow of givenness. And within the flow of givenness, there is an opere, there is an acting that's happening. There's a drama that's unfolding, and the primary protagonist is the phenomenon, the thing itself that gives itself by itself, as itself to the human subject, who interprets through what Heidegger calls the phenomenological als, and we get at the thing itself first by receiving it, and then in the lag time of the reception of the phenomenon, we attempt to describe it, never define it, and never exhaust the descriptive capacities of the hermeneutical stage of phenomenology. So, I never loved this principle of principles as much as till now, and getting time to unpack each phrase, each part of it. Husserl's principle of principles. All right, so we have many crescendos. The accents, again, are on giving, on offering, on fleshly. It's a constellation of meaning here. And then also important terms we see are everything in terms of universal, originary, original, actual in terms of what is objectively real, and intuition. You notice Husserl, he says a lot about intentionality, but more to the point is intuition. Again, for phenomenology, there's these two directions that are intersecting in the lived experience. The intentionality of the human subject facing the world, how I would interpret something that I receive, a phenomenon that gives itself, according to my intentionality. But for true phenomenology, pure phenomenology, intentionality is not Lord of the universe. The phenomenon is preferably the master of the ego. The phenomenon is what gives the ego to itself. So intuition is the primary thing for phenomenology. And what happens in intuition? Givenness flows through the aqueducts of intuition, you could say. The givenness gives itself through intuition and lands in the heart of consciousness. So intentionality meets intuition, but we see in Husserl's principle of principles, the most important thing is the givenness coming through intuition in its fleshly actuality. And he says, we have another crescendo point. So this phenomenon that offers itself originarily to us in intuition and its fleshly actuality must simply be received. Contemplative language, really. This holy simplicity of cognition, of subjectivity, that's not so puffed up that it's missing so much that wants to give itself to him. Simply be received. May the phenomenon simply be received for what es gibt, for what it gives itself. This is liturgical. This is charismatic philosophy. I mean, goodness. Because what's happening is a conversion of the ego, a conversion of the self, a humbling of the self to see, to hear, to perceive, to receive, to live. This is a tremendous experience in philosophy when this happens. This is why we dare to philosophize, because we risk being changed. We risk, to quote Tolkien, we risk the adventure. We risk getting out of our hobbit hole and going on an adventure. And so Husserl's like a Gandalf. He's saying, come, you're being summoned to this adventure. But us Baggins, us hobbits, we want to just stay in the comfortable hobbit hole. We want to just stay in the cave, going back to Plato. We don't want to risk exposure. We don't want to risk going outside, subjecting ourselves to the elements, because we're afraid of what might happen to our subjectivity in subjecting ourselves to the elements. But with Husserl, if we follow in the steps of this master, we risk everything for the sake of everything, and thereby gain everything. It's a beautiful philosophy. Okay, so to round out then this principle of all principles, he has this tagline, and for myself, how contemplative it's been up to this point. He could have just put the period right there, that things must simply be received for what it gives itself. The phenomenon must simply be received for what it gives itself, the es gibt, period. But he has to give this tagline because of these masters of suspicion, the rationalists, the neo-Kantians, but of course without passing beyond the limits in which, but he still has the last word, in which es gibt. The Selbst of the es gibt, it gives itself. It's the beginning, the end, and everything in the middle. Es gibt for phenomenology. Again, another important term the it gives, what gives, the phenomenon gives. It was most decisive for the lived experience in German. Es gibt. In German, you might say, es gibt regnet. It's raining. What's raining? It's not a metaphysical statement. It's simply a reflection of the lived experience. It rains. It's hot. It's good. So the es gibt is this neutral. Even as the Levinas calls it, eleity. There's a eleity of the es gibt, the third person, that is to say. There's something that crashes in on me, on the ego, that I can't control. I'm not its master. I'm exposed. Yes, I'm vulnerable to the es gibt, the eleity that happens in lived experience. So the end of Husserl's principles, he's admitting that there are some limits. And it's a term that will come with the intention to critique cognition. It's admitting, okay, Kant, you had some important points. We don't want to be too presumptuous when it comes to what we know, what we receive. We don't want to live in a fantasy world. Okay, that's the important point here. So phenomenology is not meant to result in what's called phenomenalism, which would be a make-believe world, which would be a fantasy world, which would be a kind of Tower of Babel in which human subjects think they invent truth, they invent the real. They could, because for the most part, there's nothing out of the boundary for phenomenology. What phenomenology can receive, describe, investigate, everything is fair game, we could say. But at the same time, as a human subject, as an individual, there are limits to what I'm receiving. For example, if I look at the phenomenon, you see, I'm not going to define it right away. This phenomenon gives itself to me. But in this lived experience, in these points of touch, in this point of view, and I can't see the hindside, the underside, the above, the left, the right. For vision, for example, it's a limited view. So I can't be presumptuous and say, I can tell you exactly what's given over here if I'm not seeing it or touching it. But I have to explore the phenomenon step by step, gradually come around this side, that side, touch it all, experience all that it has to give. This is what children do, don't they? They may receive a phenomenon. They don't know the nomenclature, but for phenomenology, that's a good thing. When I come across something, I don't know what it is metaphysically, and therefore I can better receive what it gives because I don't hastily categorize it and move on to something else. I don't prematurely decide it, but I want to receive all that it has to give. So children might take a phenomenon and explore it and push it and be fascinated. Oh my goodness, an epiphany. Perhaps a theophany. And this is where phenomenology for theology is so helpful, because it leaves open the possibility of something like divine revelation, religious experience, and an investigation of what's going on here, what's giving itself at least. So many people who claim to be atheist or think themselves atheist, we can define that atheism, as giving up on the possibility of God. Sad. And untruthful, disillusioned. Because to give up on the possibility of God and its concepts, multi, the beauty of the concept of God is it has no concept. So, the illusion of atheism as a certain kind of worldview is that it defines that which has no definition and then disagrees with it and protests it. And atheism always is right in a certain sense, that no concept pins the tail on God once and for all. Not even the word God. So God gives God. God does not give God. There's the revealed God and the concealed God. But atheism, as a more calcified ideology or kind of worldview, is a perspective that has given up on the givenness of divinity. And that is an intellectual error. Oftentimes, that point of view is provoked by difficult life experiences, traumatic life experiences, experiences of suffering and things that happen that we would say, with a metaphysical judgment, are not good. Phenomenology as a method respects every experience and wants to investigate what's going on there. But it precludes no possibility, even the possibility of impossibility. When I was sitting in class with Jean-Luc Marion, he said a beautiful thing. He said, the fact that we draw a line between possibility and impossibility, we draw a line, suggests the possibility that this line can be crossed. And Marion, in his work, investigates especially paradoxical phenomena, which essentially are the crossing between the superficial, artificial, unwarranted line that we tend to draw in the sand between possibility and impossibility. Phenomenology proclaims the impossibility of impossibility. Yet, the end of Husserl's definition here, without passing beyond the limits in which a phenomenon gives itself in a given experience. But now we're in the year 2024, not 1913, and a lot has happened in phenomenology since 1913 when Husserl wrote this and published this in Ideas 1. Marion has developed the concept of the saturated phenomenon, which is to say, how dare you, intentionality, set limits on givenness? Intentionality, are you not flooded by what gives? Are you not saturated in swimming and in over your head by what gives? By all the phenomena that give themselves by themselves as themselves, especially some with such magnitude that it's like trying to look at the sun noonday with the naked eye. You can't do it, but it doesn't mean it doesn't give. Yes, it gives. Truly, verily, definitely. So phenomenology, in this description of the universal essences of cognition, of consciousness, of phenomena, has developed now to a point where we're really challenging this tagline of Husserl's principle of principles. And we have to be very careful whenever the word limit is used. Limit as a concept also is a double-edged sword. It can imply humility, which is a good thing. And I think that's what Husserl intends here, pun intended, and intended again and again. But limit also can bring us back to the natural attitude. If I say I have all these limits, I can't do this or that, the natural attitude is starting to overcome possibility. And then phenomenology cannot be done. So phenomenology begins with looking the natural attitude in the eye and saying, there's more to life than this. The natural attitude is overcome with a movement of the heart, an intentionality of faith in possibility, which may there imply a hope in possibility. And again, what Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, calls an attitude of intellectual charity, facing oneself, facing the world, facing the other, facing God, and the possibilities of religious experience. So we have to bracket the word limit in a sense, in the name of limit, in order to experience beyond the limit. The first step of phenomenology, the epoché, the phenomenological reduction, attempts to reduce the reductionism of thought, whether that reductionism is Platonism, Aristotelianism, idealism, realism, existentialism, empiricism. Did I say rationalism, fideism, any kind of ism of thought? Communism, capitalism, the list goes on. The only ism that is not a reductionism, I would suggest, is Catholicism, because the very concept means according to the whole. So to think in a Catholic way is to think toward the whole. We must do this in philosophy. If one cannot confess this, I commit to thinking toward the whole, one is not a true philosopher. Wisdom has to do not with just parts, but with the whole. And every ism, all these that I mentioned, is a reductionism of thought. And they are legion, yes. So with the first step of phenomenology, the phenomenological reduction, we bracket the natural attitude, and another way to say natural attitude is reductionism. We bracket it, we set it aside, we open perception to this fullness of receptivity to givenness. So thank you so much for joining me, those of you who are able to join during the live stream. And again, if you have any comments, if you're still on this live stream, you can put them in the chat before I bring this to a close. But this video will be available afterwards to think about how Husserl describes phenomenology in his 1907 Göttingen lectures, The Idea of Phenomenology, as well as his Principle of Principles in his 1913 book, Ideas Pertaining to a Pure Phenomenology. and to a phenomenological philosophy, also known as Ideas 1. So if you watch this video after the fact too, feel free to put comments in the comment section, and I'm always happy to interact there. So thank you all so much for your interest in this wonderful topic of phenomenology. There's a lot more to come, and I'll see you on the next one.